And that's not to say coke and heroin aren't horrible drugs, right? But it's the prohibition of them causes so much more pain and consequence and crime, right? Than actual using it.
Willie D. Live.
Now, like I said, I did those cases. I always quoted pretty high on them. That was not the bread and butter of my criminal defensive practice. Despite a lifetime of kind of radicalized advocacy for ending the war on drugs holistically, right, with the exception of crystallized methamphetamine, fentanyl, and a handful of narcotics, I think we should see full legalization, not just decriminalization, and steward people, addicts, into hospitals and stuff. But for the most part, a lot of my work was on drug cases, right? Because I always felt like, both as a police officer and as a student, at Harvard, I did my thesis on why the war on drugs is racially and socioeconomically biased and it needed to end. And during my practice, so I never really had a lot of, for the bulk of my practice, which was fighting marijuana cases, cocaine cases, heroin cases, LSD cases that could take someone's life and completely derail it, right? Make them ineligible to be a nurse or ineligible to have any type of professional license as a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant. And the real problem with it is that typically most people are guilty of the possession they were charged with. And you have a lot of judges that are either apathetic or outright hostile to constitutional arguments. You have a Supreme Court in the Rehnquist Court, which is the Supreme Court for the decades of the 80s and 90s, that created all of this search and seizure jurisprudence just to facilitate cops searching everybody's cars and fucking with people. And then I saw that as a policeman, right? It was very easy for people to get felony arrests pulling people over and searching their car. And the way that game would work is you pull somebody over for an arrestable offense, which in Texas is basically anything but speeding. You can arrest somebody for not using their blinker. And you say to them, hey, can I search their car? And when they say no, you pull them out of the car, you handcuff them as an inventory search of the car after you arrest them. You don't find shit. And then you just say, oh, well, I decided not to arrest you. You can go. But if you find something, all of a sudden you got a felony arrest. And that was something that even as a cop I always found repugnant, right? I just didn't. I didn't, if I arrested somebody for weed, it was because they were doing some other really fucked up shit, like breaking into cars or beating somebody up or something. And I just, well, I'm going to put that weed on you too. I threw away so much weed once I got in trouble because this other officer went and snitched on me because I just didn't give a fuck, right? And I didn't care about coke and heroin. And that's not to say coke and heroin aren't horrible drugs, right? But it's the prohibition of them causes so much more pain and consequence and crime, right? Than actual using it. And it's especially aggravated in the black community, right? And that's not to suggest that black people use drugs more than white people. They don't, right? In fact, if you look at it, with the exception of Asians, the drug use of all drugs in America is pretty static in between Latino, white, and black communities. However, the prosecution is completely biased. And that's not reflected in violent crimes. We have some real disparities that I think are downstream from forced illiteracy and other things, and just people break down homes. But taking out violent crime, when you just look at prohibition, way too much enforcement in certain communities, mostly the black community in America. And you also have people police different, right? You don't search every car in a nice neighborhood because somebody's going to go complain. But you do it all the time, and that shit's crazy. I don't know. But I never had any guilt. I don't care how guilty you are in a drug case. I didn't want the government getting their hooks in you and ruining your life, and I felt very passionate about it.